All right. Welcome to another Open Team in-depth session. Today we're going to be joined by Bill Salas and Justin Fisk from Dagan to talk about DNDC and a little bit about how DNDC links in with Optus, which we've covered in a previous in-depth session. Please mute unless you're asking a question, and feel free to use the chat along the way, and we'll pause briefly between sections for questions, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end to have a brief discussion as well. And with that, Justin, Bill, take it away.
Great, thank you, Doran. So this is Bill Salas. Thank you for the opportunity to give the group an overview of DNDC and some activities we're working on with respect to O-Team and related efforts. I think we'll give a quick overview of who Dagan is, just because many of you we've interacted with you in the past through Applied Geosolutions, and Dagan's a new entity. We'll talk about the scientific basis of the DNDC model and how we've changed the software engineering architecture of the model, and then talk a little bit about sort of related activities and applications related to the overarching Open Team themes regarding agri-ecosystems and markets. So Dagan's a new company. We spun off from Applied Geosolutions really to focus on how we can help agriculture build the business case for soil health, because there are multiple benefits of soil health associated with both soil carbon sequestration, but better moisture retention and overarching reduced costs of inputs and producing a more resilient production system. So Dagan's really focused on how we can bring geospatial technologies to help build the business case for growers to implement practices that result in improving soil health. It's a relatively new company. We formed it about a year ago as a spin out from Applied Geosolutions. We had some external investment from an impact investor that was concerned about issues related to food security and climate change. And I think the core technologies at Dagan are really all integrated in with the O-Team effort. You had a presentation by the team on Optus and GIPS a few months ago. Today we're going to talk about the DNDC work. And then at the end we'll talk a little bit about how we bring these technologies together at scale to look at soil health practices across the Corn Belt and outcomes associated with changes in practices that improve soil health. So I guess as a matter of background, the DNDC model was developed by a dear friend and colleague of ours, Dr. Chung-Chin Lee at the University of New Hampshire. He started the development in the early 1990s, and his mission at that point in time was really to understand how to model nitrous oxide emissions from agroecosystems. And so he named the model DNDC after the two key processes that drive nitrous oxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in general from agricultural soils, and that's the denitrification and decomposition, or DNDC. The model has been around for a long time. The first publications were in the early 1990s. It's used pretty extensively internationally, and it's fairly well published with several hundred peer-reviewed publications on applications ranging from sort of model development, evaluation of the model for different agroecosystems, and using the tool for looking at mitigation opportunities and inventories at various scales. The model has also been used for trying to monetize environmental outcomes of agronomic practices through ecosystem service markets, whether they're insets or offsets. And that's an opportunity that's coming into focus now. There's a lot more attention to how ecosystem service markets can help cover some of the costs of changing agronomic practices to enhance soil health and produce more resilient production systems. Unfortunately, Professor Lee passed away a few years ago, and so we've taken on ourselves to sort of keep the research going with the DNDC model, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the software engineering aspects of work we've done to make the model more accessible to the global research community. So I'll spend a little bit of time focusing on the scientific basis of the model. So, you know, from a very simple first principles perspective, greenhouse gas they're basically a byproduct of microbial processes to produce CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane. And those processes are driven by basically three high-level drivers. One is the soil redox conditions that determines which microbial communities have an energy or a thermodynamic advantage over others. And then how active they are depends on the amount of dissolved organic carbon in the soil, and how persistent the microbes survive depends on if there's sufficient electron acceptors to receive the electrons and create that byproduct of whether oxygen as an electron acceptor for CO2, nitrate for N2O, and organic carbon for methane in general, at a very high level. But we know that farming practices influence all three of those sort of high-level drivers, influence the amount of DOC, EH, and the amount of electron acceptors in the soil profile. So tillage, for example, changes the soil environmental conditions, which simultaneously influence all three pools. So from a DNDC perspective, was really trying to link how these different management levers, which are tools that we can look at to assess mitigation opportunities, influence the main drivers that then factor into the net production of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the conceptual basis of the DNDC model. You know, at a more detailed level, the scientific basis is we need to be able to model all of the processes that result in the production and consumption of greenhouse gas emissions. These are both oxidation and reduction processes. So, for example, N2O is produced both by an oxidation of ammonium through nitrification processes or through a reduction of nitrate and denitrification processes. So DNDC was set up so that you can model simultaneously both processes, so both an oxidation and a reduction process in the same soil volume at a given time. And so this figure just sort of illustrates how the model uses soil redox as a thermodynamic lever to determine which greenhouse gases are produced and consumed based on the soil redox. At a high level, we can think of the model as sort of a series of 6 submodels. So if we look at this figure from the top, we have a bunch of ecological drivers, weather and climate, the type of soils, the type of crop you're growing, and the type of management systems that you're implementing. And those ecological drivers simultaneously influence the soil environment, but they also influence how well the crop grows, and the soil environment then influences the decomposition rates and the plant growth in terms of sort of those are 3 submodels that will drive our soil environmental factors within the model. Then those soil environmental factors will drive the other biogeochemical processes, namely denitrification, nitrification, and fermentation. And as I mentioned before, because of the structure of the model, we're able to model simultaneously different redox processes and outcomes. So in terms of the discussions on linking in with open team activities, so here's a quick sort of summary of the types of inputs and outputs that the model provides. So weather is a key driver in this, in the model. It utilizes daily time step. So we need, at a minimum, we need estimates of daily temperature and precipitation. We can model all of the other climate drivers, but ideally we would actually have access to those data directly. The soil environmental conditions has a huge impact on these processes. So at a minimum, we need to know soil both density, texture, organic carbon, and pH. And those data can then be used to estimate other soil biophysical characteristics through soil phytotransfer functions to be able to model the full physical characteristics of the soils. And the type of management information that the model can handle is information on, we need to know the types of crops that are grown, when they're planted, when they're harvested, what types of tillage systems are being used, is the field irrigated? If it is, how much irrigation per day, and all information on fertilizer and organic amendments We also have done work on grazing systems, and so the model needs to understand stocking densities in terms of different paddocks for grazing systems. And lastly, we've done a fair amount of work with the model looking at rice, and so flooding water management for rice is a key driver for methane production and consumption. So in rice production systems, we need daily information on flooding dynamics. Simple outputs of the model are basically how well the crop is growing, and so you can see daily photosynthesis, respiration, and daily uptake of water and nitrogen demand from the soil profile, how the crop is allocating carbon to the various tissues, and then at the end, the production of the merchantable yield, as well as litter production, which then drives subsequent carbon dynamics in the soils and production and consumption of greenhouse gas emissions. And then models all of the soil environmental factors that we highlighted before, and it provides an estimate of soil carbon dynamics or turnover of soil organic matter, nitrogen leaching, and full suite of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as NOx and ammonia emissions, because that's a key aspect of the full nitrogen balance that we have to be able to model if we're going to do a good job on nitrous oxide emissions. So there's burgeoning research using the tool to do NOx inventories. We're working with the state of California to use DNDC to enhance their statewide inventory on NOx. So Dorn, that's a quick very high-level overview of the model, the scientific basis, and high-level inputs and outputs of the model. I think we will now maybe step forward and talk a little bit about the software infrastructure of the model, how it's evolved, and how we'll be able to be linking it into the broader OTEAM efforts. Or do you want to pause for questions at this point?
Yeah, let's pause briefly just for any questions before we go on to the next.
Hey, Bill, this is Christoph from Nori. Do you have uncertainty ranges on your CO2 estimates?
We have uncertainty estimates on our nitrous oxide, methane, and soil carbon sequestration estimates. And we'll show some figures on how we do that a little bit later in the presentation.
Great.
All right. I suggest keep rolling, Bill.
All right.
This is Justin. I'm going to take over here for a moment. As Bill mentioned, the model development started in the early 90s, so it's almost 3 decades of development on this, and primary focus on developing the science, and written largely by scientists and people whose background is not software engineering. So you can imagine that, is it this? Yeah, or you can click there. With no major refactoring in this development, and you can imagine that the code base had become quite cumbersome. And so we set out a few years ago to address some of the shortcomings, to open up some, make it easier to incorporate new changes into the model. I'm getting ahead of myself. The code was research grade. It was buggy. It was fragile. It was very difficult to understand. There were about 185,000 lines of code in this single monolithic structure that was difficult to test individual components of. It was very difficult to make changes because things were too coupled together, so you make a small change and it would break some other part of the code. It was polluted with unused legacy code that had been developed for projects over time, and new submodules had been developed to replace them, and there was a lot of code that made it very difficult to follow what was going on. And it was tightly coupled to a Windows graphical user interface, which really prevented scaling this in any way. There were some legacy design decisions that made it very difficult to run on multiple processors on the same machine, and it was really designed with this interface that made it very easy for for individual users to get data in and out of the model for site level runs, but but couldn't be scaled to larger problems. The input format was very specific to DNDC. It was hard to work with programmatically, so it was hard to link to other software systems, and the output formats were the same. It was sort of hard to ingest that data into other places. And then there were just general, memory leaks, memory corruption, redundant calculations, things that just, it could use some cleanup after years of development. So we set out several years ago to start from the ground up, focus on modern software engineering practices, and really get to where, with an emphasis on getting this to where it could scale to larger systems. Emphasis on code modularity, reduced code coupling, more unit testing, more accountability in the code, development of APIs to interface with other software systems. This is relevant to Open Team, and used a much more standardized input and output format. The input is a JSON string, which can easily be controlled programmatically from other interfaces. It's used through the API. The output is configurable, so you can get just the outputs you are interested in a format that's easy to ingest into other software. We've developed interfaces to the driver data that Bill mentioned earlier, that you need climate and soil data so that you can easily extract data for the sites you're interested in without a lot of grunt work to do that. And we expose a lot more model parameters to the user so that it's more clear what things are driving the model.
Yeah, just add to that. I mean, I think a lot of research models suffer from this issue of version control. And when you publish a paper now, the whole idea is you can actually have an external parameter set that you publish along with the paper, because how one has the internal calibrations really influence the performance of the model, obviously. And so we thought that was really important in terms of having a transparent way of making sure that it was clear what version you use and you publish that parameter set with it.
And also as a side benefit, it's cross-platform now. It's no longer locked to Windows, which opens up to high-performance computing environments and such. So what
Can I ask you a quick question? Sorry to interrupt. This is Christoph. Do you have a link to that code base to see those versions? Sorry, if you could share that in the chat, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So, Bill, do you want to? So we are intending to open up this code to the research community, but we've sort of been slow rolling that out. So I don't have an open repository to share at the moment, but we are hoping to do that in the future.
So and that will be a part of the schemas and links to repositories that will also be part of the Open Team sort of rollout here as well. So stay tuned. That's a byproduct of this process.
A lot of our work over the last year or two has been taking this new code base and building the infrastructure that can take advantage of the additional scaling capabilities that it provides. And so we've designed this cloud-based infrastructure that makes use of GIPs to extract some of the driver data, climate data, extract soils, the connections to Optus for tillage practices and cover cropping, and geospatial databases of the fields you're simulating, rotational timelines for those fields, et cetera. And there's a pre-processing system that can ingest that data and format it into the form that DNDC needs. And that gets fed into an auto-scaling DNDC cluster through a simulation API to perform massive suites of simulations. And that gets fed into a post-processing cluster, which can take the data that's coming out of DNDC and do summary statistics and other things, and provide those back through another API. Internally, we use the system just like that, and are now at a state where we can run several million simulations in a few hours. It also provides, you can interact directly with the API This is probably most relevant to OpenTeam, where you could provide model inputs directly into the simulation API, or potentially provide the model inputs that you have and use the back-end sort of middle layer, or we call this the pre-processing and controller, to extract the data that you don't have available. So could it automatically extract the climate or the soil information or general management practices for that area, or things like that, things that are missing. So you can use a hybrid approach of either the feed DNDC the full information, or make use of the whole suite of tools. At this point, I think we're going to move on.
Any questions on the pieces that Justin just covered? If not, I'll move on to the validation and some of the applications.
Sounds like we should keep rolling.
All right. So how well does it work? So this is an example of some extensive work we did with the state of California on validating DNDC's estimate of nitrous oxide emissions. The figure on the bottom, if you're not familiar with nitrous oxide emissions, they're really difficult to model because they're highly episodic. And as the panel on the bottom shows, the circles are measured nitrous oxide emissions for a vineyard in California, and the red line shows the model. But you can see that, you know, the bulk of seasonal or annual emissions can occur over 1 or 2 pulses, especially in a Mediterranean climate like California, where you seldom have high moisture and high nitrate and ammonium content in the soil. So the model was really designed to capture those episodic events. The figure above it shows how well the model performed against a large independent validation data set that include a wide variety of cropping systems, including, you know, the traditional row crops, wheat and corn, but also vegetables, tree crops and vine crops, and perennial systems like alfalfa. So overall, the model performed quite well. And so to get to your question about model performance, Christoph, what we do is we then do a statistical analysis of the modeled versus measured residuals to characterize the uncertainty in the model for market applications. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a later slide. But the outcome of this project was that the California Air Resources Board has decided to use DNDC. They used it for their statewide inventory, initially just for N2O, but now for soil carbon, methane, and then soon they will also be using it for the NOx inventory. So it seems to work quite well in California. This figure shows, the figure on the left is we've done extensive validation of the model.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Bill?
Yes.
How many years of data does that require to get you those levels? Does additional years reduce the uncertainty for you? Or are there variables that you found can provide improvements based on what you learned in California?
Yeah. So I think the lesson we learned in California, and then also in other activities, is, you know, even when a model I think is performing quite well, as illustrated here, the uncertainty, if you were to apply that model for one single field, is still quite high. Mm-hmm. And so we need to ask the question in terms of how well is the model performing. We can answer the question at the individual field scale or in aggregate across all the fields. And so through that process with the Air Resources Board, they developed a rice methane protocol based on DNDC, and they made the policy decision that what we call the structural uncertainty deduction, which is the uncertainty from the model when you have all the inputs, that should be applied at the aggregate scale, which is really important for ecosystem service markets, because, you know, something like nitrous oxide is highly episodic. Even a model that performs quite well like DNDC, you can have large uncertainties for any particular field. But how well is it performing for the aggregate of fields is sort of where we think the market should value that structural uncertainty piece. We don't have a standard rule of thumb in terms of what is enough data to say, okay, we now have the appropriate structural uncertainty understanding, but we're working through that. We're building a very large database to begin to ask that question across the US and internationally. And one of the advantages of the code rewrite that Justin has done is we can build an automated test bed to use as many independent data to ask some of those questions. So I think that's something that we're continuing to work on. The research question is in terms of what's the appropriate number of independent data to quantify uncertainty for market use.
Yeah, that sort of tracks with Nori is an ecosystem service market that's only focused on soil organic carbon to aggregate significant projects. And that's where I just am, perhaps not to be a pester on this call, but trying to push in the spirit of what Open Team I think is all about, is how might we contribute data, which is collecting the inputs into the parameters that you have that actually moves the science further in an open way. So it over time evolves. We're not like a wait and see, but we've got data ready to share that moves this, reducing the structural uncertainty from both the number of years of a specific project and then the types of projects and then the projects across a certain region. And so I'm just really curious to your general thoughts of how to push on that.
Yeah. I mean, our general thoughts on the sort of we'll get to the different regions piece maybe, is that the scientific basis of DNDC is it's applicable anywhere. However, it's a model, and we know models are models, and so we want to constantly test that hypothesis. So right now we're doing extensive validation across all the land resource regions in the U.S. And right now, characterizing the performance of the model at the land resource region scale, which is where sort of traditionally people have said, well, if you've got a good calibration and validation for that region, then it's applicable in that region. But we want to challenge that hypothesis by looking at the performance from a rigorous statistical perspective across different regions and saying, do we really need to have different regional performance metrics, or can we use all the data in aggregate to get a better understanding statistically of model uncertainty for market use?
Am I wrong in understanding the soil monitoring network of the USDA that sort of has longitudinal studies that can calibrate these models? If there are additional fields that might be integrating these studies and then sharing into a national repository, basically helps this as well?
Definitely. I mean, as a modeler, the more data we can get, independent data we can get to test the model, the better we can characterize how well it's working, and maybe identify weaknesses in the model, and so that leading to model improvements over time. So, I mean, the validation is useful for the market use, but also very useful for testing and questioning the scientific basis of the model as we move forward and have access to more and more data.
And so yeah, sorry for capitalizing this call. I just hope it's interesting to others too. But okay, let's say that there's new inputs to a model whereby a producer is now applying something to their fields, which is a microbial solution that's known to increase soil organic carbon. Is that input parameter something that your model would think about incorporating, and through calibration of certain soil tests would be useful as people might share that data with you?
So yes, but we would need to translate that intervention or that technical that amendment into the scientific framework of DNDC. So we'd have to think through how that microbial amendment influences microbial activity in the model, and then test it to see with that independent data that has been demonstrated that it actually increases soil organic carbon content. So we'd have to be able to test that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This is Patrick from Cool Farm Alliance here. I am appreciating this discussion, and it just kind of seems like it's a fairly common need. Obviously, the intention of reducing structural uncertainty across, at as granular a scale as is necessary and feasible. I'm wondering if it seems like because of that common need, I'm wondering if it might even warrant some kind of working group as well within Open Team, just as far as like the data sharing for the purposes of validation and calibration. Just an idle thought there. But.
Yep.
I think that's an excellent idea, and I think we have some might be a good thing both as a working group and also to have a specific conversation around that, and perhaps start a goat forum around it as well.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Great.
So we sort of keep moving forward, and so the panel on the left shows the rice methane performance of the model, and then the panel on the right is really just to sort of highlight the need for linking carbon and nitrogen. So this is just showing some N2O data, both measured and modeled, and how the organic matter or soil carbon content of the soils has an influence on the magnitudes of nitrous oxide. And that's primarily because as you have more organic matter in the soils, you have both the shift in the moisture dynamics in the soils, as well as a lot more dissolved organic carbon, which can support a much larger microbial population to produce nitrous oxide when the soil environmental conditions are ideal for nitrous oxide production. So it's just that linkage between carbon and nitrogen that's so critical as we begin to move forward and think about efforts for soil carbon sequestration. I think we also need to look at the trace gases, because you can have impacts if you don't adjust your nitrogen management accordingly, associated with increases in N2O emissions as you enhance soil organic matter. On the soil carbon side, we've done some extensive testing, and we're actually in the midst of a larger effort, but this is just sort of some typical data from the Morrow plots in Illinois showing measured versus modeled. And we're really sort of building that large test bed so we can answer some of these questions on soil carbon as that becomes a central focus for these new markets as they come forward. But one thing we did, actually, this is in collaboration with colleagues in Canada, which is to look at the noise of the vegetation. And they pulled out a test out of using DNDC directly out of the box, so no calibration whatsoever, for fallow sites in Europe. And basically said, these are the fallow sites, this is the initial carbon content, run the model, and compare against measured data. And so this gives us a pretty good indication that the base processes on rates of decomposition in DNDC seem to capture, in this case, the European conditions. Our colleagues in Canada are working on publishing this. But it's another way of sort of looking at an aspect of the processes that affect soil carbon and decomposition rates, is to sort of remove the influence of the plant, which actually, obviously provides litter into the soils, but look at just the microbial processes on their own. And that's reflected here in these fallow study sites. So what are we doing with these tools in the context of Open Team and what Dagan is up to? Is really trying to link our satellite-based tools like Optus with DNDC to track soil health practices at scale. So if you think about the principles of soil health management, right? You want to have a diverse cropping system with rotations. You want to minimize soil disturbance. You want to keep green cover on the field at all time and have living roots. You want to protect the soil whenever you can with residue. And then there's emerging research on, integrating livestock into that system for soil health outcomes. With our Optus platform, we can look at the first four of those principles directly at the field scale and at the watershed to national scale. And then DNDC can then begin to be used and other tools to look at the benefits of healthy soils. What are the outcomes associated with it in terms of increased soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, how that influences nutrient cycling and microbial diversity in the soils. So we recently had a project to do this with TNC and CTIC, where we used Optus to map conservation practices across the entire Corn Belt from 2005 through 2017-18 at the field scale. So we had about 1.9 million field segments, I believe, where we have annual characteristics of tillage systems and cover cropping, crop type, to then look at how conservation practices have been adopted across the Corn Belt. The lower right panels show that at the Corn Belt scale, actually conservation tillage has been fairly flat since 2005. But we see that cover crops has really sort of taken off starting in 2015. And that's sort of synced up with a lot of the incentive programs that have been in place to incentivize and co-fund cover cropping with cost share programs and other efforts. The figures on the upper right show just at the watershed scale, the aggregate information that we have on the different soil health practices. We then use those data to track at a very high level general trends in soil health. So the lower left panel shows general trends in soil carbon over that time period. And then what would have happened had the conservation practices not been adopted, and that's that SOC difference. You know, with the adoption of conservation practices during this time frame, we've been able to enhance soil carbon sequestration by, roughly 0.2 to 0.4 tons of carbon per hectare. Now we're going through and doing that extensive validation to be able to give us an error estimate on those estimates. But the point is we're bringing together these different technologies to sort of set the baseline. Where do we stand right now on soil health at scales that range from field scale to large geographies like the Corn Belt? We're also using these tools to look at county and grain shed, supply shed scales, where we have a lot of interest from CPGs and others in terms of understanding their Scope 3 emissions. So how can we use these technologies to help them understand trends as they sort of incentivize their supply chain to adapt practices that enhance soil carbon, for example. And so again, linking the satellite-based monitoring with DNDC can help you understand those differences over time. And then as we go through with the extensive validation, we understand how those uncertainties in our quantified outcomes are influenced by the aggregation scale. And then related to that, we're working closely with the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium and with others on how these tools can be used to effectively scale the market so we can have a scientifically robust estimate of these ecosystem service assets that can then be monetized for the growers, but also be done at scale at very low cost, and how we can reduce the need for a lot of verification data collection by using satellite monitoring, as well as it can reduce the cost of input data collection. If you can monitor agronomic practices from space, then you can really reduce your costs for data collection and verification. And as you all may know, the Open Team has joined the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. And so it'll be exciting to sort of think through these issues with a large group and with other Open Team members on how to bring these tools to create effective markets. So, Dorn, that's pretty much the summary that we thought we would sort of highlight with the group today, but shall we open up the floor to questions and discussion?
Yeah, absolutely, of which I'm sure there's a lot. So
I guess I'll kick it off if that's all right. This is Daniela with the Cool Farm Tool. And and Sustainable Food Lab. Is that all right? Just feel great to hear from you. I'm always just awed by what DNDC can do, and very exciting. The slide showing DNDC's performance in a sort of a blind, blind comparison. I just wanted to confirm what the dots and what the lines were and what was what was measurement relative to model. But just let me also mention my other question, which was, I think, the slide previous about the correlation between soil carbon increases and N2O increases. And I wanted to, which I think was your point, and I wanted to understand how well established that relationship is. The if it is a really clear correlation, then it just seems like any evaluation of soil carbon really has to be paired with N2O, which I always thought was the case, but I'm not sure how much that is done, especially in emerging markets. So I just wanted to understand the strength of that correlation. So those are my two questions.
Okay. Great. So so this is the figure I think that your first question is based on. And so if you think about, at least from our modeling, the model construct is soil organic carbon stocks. It's sort of always in a dynamic equilibrium, and it's driven by two main factors. One is rates of decomposition and the amount of organic matter going into the soils. Okay, if you just think of it in a very sort of a simplistic way, it's an ongoing balance in terms of the amount of organic matter that's going into the soils and the production of the microbial communities with the rates of decomposition, rates of turnover of that organic matter. So by modeling fallow sites, we're removing the question about how much organic matter is going into the soils. We're looking just at the component of the model that's the rates of decomposition for the different organic matter pools in the soil. So what we're seeing here is the dots are measurements across these six sites, and the line is the model. So the only thing that was done to model those sites was the location of the site and the starting carbon stock at that time of that measurement program.
Gotcha.
And then the weather from that through the end of the census period, so 2010 or 2009 in some of these long-term studies. So the only thing that was done is initialize soil carbon stocks, run the model daily through this time period, and you get annual measured soil carbon stocks, and that's the line that we see. And so my interpretation of that is that the inherent structure of the decomposition pools in DNDC is capturing things fairly well. Now, I must preface that by saying we're learning a lot now about how soil aggregates and soil structure influences those processes as well. And so as that science moves forward, I think we'll see an evolution in how soil carbon dynamics are modeled. But just at a high level, the current set of pools and turnover rates for DNDC seem to capture these rates of decomposition for these fallow sites across Europe. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. And then this piece is a figure on the right. Now, again, this is again a log scale, but it was just meant to show the relationship between, in general, measured N2O and the organic carbon content of those soils. So the boxes and dots are different organic matter or organic carbon levels, from very poor soils to high, very organic, fairly rich soils, up to 40% carbon. And what you see is those sites that have higher organic matter typically have higher N2O emissions. And the reason I bring that up is there's a relationship between carbon and nitrogen, right? There's always this linkage between both the influence of organic matter on microbial pools, but also actually to grow soil carbon, you need to have enough nitrogen to protect that carbon. So this issue of, as we would think about soil carbon sequestration, we need to keep an eye on nitrous oxide. Because if you think about sort of the benefits of soil health from a grower's perspective, one of the arguments is you can reduce inputs over time as you enhance soil organic matter. And that's because you're now going to create better mineralization of nitrogen. So you don't have to apply as much mineral nitrogen. And that's reflected in this relationship between nitrous oxide and soil carbon in this figure.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions and as you digest this, we're available anytime, obviously by email to chat about it. I think Dornan just requested that we provide sort of a scientific basis of the DNDC model and an overview of what we're doing and how it will relate to our open team efforts over the next several years. So we're looking forward to collaborating with everybody and figuring out how to address this climate issue and risk and resilience in our production systems.
Hey, Bill, this is Patrick Lawrence here again. I'm just curious, do you know if, and I'm probably just not aware of it, but any equivalent to AgMIP for these soil carbon and emissions models? If you're familiar with AgMIP.
Yeah, good question. I am not. I'm not, Patrick.
So, well, Bill, I was on mute the last bit there, so there was a little bit of a pause.
Yeah, actually, Patrick, to answer your question, there is a Global Research Alliance effort that's sort of similar to AgMIP that's doing some model-to comparison work. And I think the folks in Agro-Canada are directly involved, and I can put you in contact with them if that would be of use, but we're not participating in it. But I believe there's a series of Global Research Alliance projects basically mimicking AgMIP to look at model and comparisons for climate.
Awesome, thank you.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you for completing that. I wanted to just perhaps prime the conversation a little bit on the modular structure and connectivity between Optus and DNDC, and then also perhaps link in the conversation that Ian and Mike have been having in terms of structure and dealing with common libraries. So perhaps I'll leave it up to maybe Justin and Mike to jump in on that.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Perhaps I'm putting Mike Stenta on the spot if he's muted right now, but I just wanted to have him jump in here to see how our conversation on that side feeds into our conversation around data flow.
Yeah. So, Ian and I had spent a little bit of time talking about the outputs well, so we were specifically, I think, talking more about the map layer output. So I'm not sure if it's a direct relation to this, but it was kind of generally about how to host those layers so that they could then be used in other systems.
Yeah, I think that go ahead.
Oh, that's okay.
I think that the types of data that are going to be exchanged here are very different. And I think, we already have built into this system a way to exchange data between Optus and DNDC, and between DNDC and other sort of management database systems. And so I think you and I should coordinate a bit on what kinds of data could be provided to DNDC to run it, because it's a very large number of inputs that are required, and it probably makes sense to not require the user to enter everything and to develop some kind of a reduced input sort of scenario-based tool from DNDC. And so we should coordinate on what kinds of data we could get out of FarmOS or others, and how that data exchange would work. But we have a lot of the pieces built for this already in terms of JSON APIs to pass information back and forth to the model and get outputs.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to get at.
Great.
That we've got, you know, in the case of you may have remote sensed activity data, and then in some cases we may have very high resolution field level data coming from systems like FarmOS or from other farm management systems that have been passed through FarmOS. So I just wanted to sort of prime that that conversation in terms of how DNDC might, when you're aggregating that, how you might handle those diverse sets, or whether they're run as batches and then aggregated after the fact. So just a
Right, great. Yeah, I look forward to talking to you more about that, Mike, because I think there's some details to work out, but a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I agree. Great.
good. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Do we have time for perhaps one more question? And if not, we'll just I'll pause there. Great, thank you so much, Justin and Bill, for sharing, and we're looking forward to the next in-depth session, which I believe Nori is on the books. We may have another one in the interim, but look forward to having you all join us again soon. And thank you all again.
Thank you, Doran. Thanks for the opportunity, and we look forward to following up with everybody.